Welcome to a design video tutorial. My name is Ryan Rosenthal. In this session we're going to look at creating 3D text in After Effects. Here's an example of what we're going to be going for in this lesson. You can see I have some text placed on the screen. I've turned it into 3D and then I've added a short animation to spin it around so we can get a look at what we're creating here. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. First thing we're going to do is we're going to open up After Effects and we're going to create a new composition. The new composition, the settings you're going to want to make sure are appropriate for whatever it is that you're creating this piece for. For our purposes today, I'm just going to have a relatively smaller window here and leave the rest of the settings as is. Now when you get into After Effects, the first thing that we want to do is we want to create the actual text that we're going to work with. So I'm going to go ahead here and click my text tool, and then on the screen I'm going to place some text. So as I had before, I'm just going to place 3D text. Now you want to go ahead and grab this text and resize it, place it where you want into your scene. For our purposes, this is just fine right here. Now a couple different things you can do in the scene to help be able to visualize this text that's on the screen is, first thing I want to do is I want to get rid of the black background. I'm just going to go ahead and add a layer. I'm going to add a solid layer here. And the solid layer I'm going to make a little bit lighter gray instead of the dark black. So I'm just going to say go ahead to that, and then I want to make sure I place it underneath the text so that the text is on top. Now to make 3D text, there's a couple different ways that we could do it in the past. We could stack various different layers of the same text and create the effect that we have the thicker text or the extruded text. Another way that we could do this is by using some different effects, such as the shatter effect is one way that we've done 3D text in the past. With the newer version of After Effects, such as the CS6, we actually have a new feature that's been included that we want to look at today. And what that is it's actually a 3D built into the layer itself. So if we come down here and make sure that we go into our 3D layer, we want to turn this on. If you don't see this, you'll have to toggle or switch your modes until you see this option here. But when we select this option, what you're going to notice is that we have this new renderer available. And what this means is we can go in here, we can actually, instead of using the classic 3D, we can now look at ray traced 3D. And with ray traced 3D, what we're going to have is several different options now included. We can extrude, we can bevel, we can create reflections, various different options that we have to work in our 3D scene. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us now some additional features within our text. So instead of just the materials and the text options themselves, we now are actually going to have these different bevel and extrude options to work with. When we look at 3D text, there's a couple of different things that we have to figure in here. In order to be 3D, we need a couple of different things to happen. One, we need the actual object to have shape or depth to it, and the other is we need to have a perspective of this object. So in other words, we need to create a camera that's going to allow us to see this 3D happening. So the couple of different things I need to do here. The first thing that I want to do is I want to go up to layer and say new, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say new camera, and this is going to allow us to place a camera into our After Effects scene. For our purposes, the presets are just fine. You can change this to whatever you want, 35mm, 50mm. Again, this is going to be determined by the project that you're working on itself. So I'm just going to go ahead and say OK to that. The next thing that I'm going to want to do is I want to go into the text and start looking at these options that we have. And you'll notice now, instead of just the transform options, we now have these geometry options. And this is where the 3D is going to start happening here. If you look here, there's an extrusion depth, and that's the one that's really going to create the effect. So you can kind of go in and set any settings you want. I'm just going to go ahead and we'll try a 75, and we'll see how that works for us. Now you'll notice that when you change different settings, the software has to kind of think through and render that out. A couple of different things you can do that we're going to work with here are using things like the caps lock key. What the caps lock key is going to do is it's going to turn off that render for every frame, so I can make multiple different changes before I have to wait for the machine to catch up with what it's doing. Now, I set the extrusion depth, and you can see it kind of changed how the text looks here, but again, it's not really clear what's happening here. I can tell that they're starting to take shape, but it's hard to see. So something I'm going to do to help me visualize this is to go in and create a new layer. So I'm going to say new layer, and I want to create a light into this layer. And this light is going to allow me to do just that, place a light into the scene. I can control the color of the light, I control its intensity, the fall off, the cones, all these different settings. And again, it's going to come down to the project what these specific settings are set to. For our purposes, I'm just going to go ahead and say OK to that. And when you get the light into the scene, you're going to notice that, again, it's going to render off that frame. But you can see already how much this is helping us actually see the difference between the face of our text and what's happening with the depth of the shape of it. Now with this light, you can move it around. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to hit my caps lock so it turns off that render. Grab my move tool here, and then we can, not the text, we want to move the light itself. Let me go ahead and render this frame right here just to get a visual again. And with this light, we want to move the light, again, place it wherever is appropriate for your scene, and then the focus of the light we can also change up. So I'm going to try something like that. I'm going to go ahead and render that frame. And then we can see how that's starting to affect that text. So just go ahead and move it around a little bit, play with it, get it set to what looks appropriate for the project you're working at. And this is where the design comes in. This is where choice of font, the depth of the extrude that you're doing, all this has to be worked with here. The last thing I'm going to do is go in and just set a real quick animation for this. So I'm going to go into the transform of the text layer, and then you'll notice there's some different rotations here. So in other words, if I look at my Y rotation, I can see that it's going to spin the text around on that Y axis. What I'm going to want to do is notice that it's rotating around the 3 of the 3D text and not the center. So what we can do is go in here and we can grab our pan behind, or our anchor point. And with the anchor point, again, make sure that we're not on the light, we're on the text layer itself. Grab the anchor point, and then I can reset this anchor point to be wherever I need it to be in the scene. So in other words, I want this rotating around the central point there instead of the edge. So by doing that anchor point, I can reset that anchor on the text. Once you have all that placed where you want it, we're going to go down here, we're going to go into our transform, and we want our Y rotation, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to start up keyframes. So I'm going to set the initial key here at 0, move it to wherever is appropriate for your scene. I'm going to say, at this 5-second mark, I want it to rotate 360 degrees. Or I can say on this 0 in front of the X, I want it to rotate 1 times. That's just an easier way of saying, rotate once instead of 360 here. Once that's set, we now have 3D animated text. So from here, we're just going to want to go ahead and render this out so we can file, export, and add it to our render queue. Once it's in our render queue, we have it named how we want it, we can go ahead and say render. And that will give us 3D animated text. So thank you for watching this lesson on 3D animated text in After Effects.